My co-host from the League of Women Voters, Carolyn Platt, will now introduce our first speaker. Carolyn?
Good evening. Our first speaker is Dan Grower, who is an environmental engineer with over 30 years experience remediating soil and groundwater. He specializes in understanding the fate and transport of chemicals in the environment and applying innovative in situ remedies to sites with complex chemistry and geology. Dan is a longtime Acton resident. Professionally, he has participated in projects in every EPA region: Europe, South America, Asia, and Australia. Dan has a degree in chemical engineering from the University of Connecticut and an MS in environmental engineering from MIT. For the last several years, Dan has worked on an intensive PFAS remedial investigation at a site in Massachusetts. Dan?
Hello, everyone. I'm going to take a moment, and I think I'm going to freeze for a moment, but I'm going to bring up my slides. So. Okay, so this is the start of my presentation. So I'm going to start us off by sort of laying the groundwork, talking about what PFAS are, how they get into the environment, what is a classic, typical things we do with them in the environment. But I want to say all of that should be couched with the recognition that PFAS is this brand new group of chemicals that we are worried about now. We've only been really looking at them and thinking about them for a decade or so. And there's an intense amount of study and understanding being developed about them, but the story is not even close to being written yet about them. So what are they? Kim said before, there's this funny term called perfluoroalkyl and polyfluoroalkyl substances. They're a class of thousands of compounds, and some people say 5,000, I've heard 8,000, 3,000, thousands of compounds. And some of them are bigger than others, and some of them are more mobile in the environment, and some of them are more toxic. And it's what we know a fair amount about some of them and not very much about many of them. So the two that we talk about the most, so that you may have read about in the news or heard about, are PFOA, perfluorooctanoic acid, and PFAS, perfluorooctane sulfonic acid, which is actually what that little chemical thing is over there on the side. And they are the ones that are regulated by the EPA. They've been regulated for the longest, and those are the ones that are probably the most commonly found in the environment and most worried about. And I guess the little bit of chemistry that I'll talk about in this talk is that what makes them sort of the thing that they are is that they are made up of mostly carbon atoms and fluorine atoms. And the carbon-fluorine bond is extremely strong. So it means that they are very resistant to reactions. So bacteria are not really able to cleave that bond and biodegrade them. We can't do things to them. Makes them very useful, but it also makes them very persistent in the environment. Some people call them forever chemicals. So it's a thing that it's a characteristic of theirs. And they've been used for the last 80, 90 years in a wide variety of applications. And several of them are listed here, but we all have used them ourselves. The use of Scotchgard had them. It was in Rain-X, the stuff that you put in your windshield wipers. Gore-Tex would have PFAS compounds. Teflon pans for a long time would have PFAS compounds. they're like the most effective, best firefighting materials that we have. So anyway, they're used in a lot of a lot of our world, and consequently they've made it into the environment in many, many different places. And so here's a little bit of a timeline about them. We started using them in the 30s. We've used them for a variety of things over the years. And somewhere around the year 2000, we went, uh-oh, maybe we didn't realize that these were going to be so persistent in the environment and that they were going to stick around forever. And that we could find them in all sorts of places in the environment, including ourselves. So mostly we all have some PFAS in us, and it sticks around in our bodies for a while, and then if we don't take in a new PFAS, we'll eventually get rid of it, but almost everybody has it in their blood. So it's considered an emerging contaminant, and emerging contaminants are sort of special in the regulatory world, in that we know that we are worried about them. We don't know exactly how worried we have to be, and what we don't know about them tends to be as much as what we do know about them. And so regulators, Sandy is one of them, are trying to figure out the best way to help us manage these things in our lives and in the environment. A few more ideas about places you might find them. So there are a lot of large-scale places that you would find these. The military sites, there is a plane surrounded by firefighting foam, which has a lot of PFAS in it. You find it in landfills, waste disposal areas, but you also find them being released in very small amounts in places that aren't listed here, and they could be in lots of places, which we'll talk about a little bit when we get to Matt's part of the talk. What happens when a compound or a set of compounds get released to the environment is they move in the environment. They enter the stream, they enter groundwater, they might enter the air, and they get shuttled around the environment. Oftentimes they get taken up by biota, by microorganisms, and then macroorganisms. They might bioaccumulate, and when the most compounds that get released into the environment actually biodegrade, so they will have a finite lifetime. But PFAS, we haven't discovered what that finite lifetime is, so we're trying to figure out where to look for them and how to, if we find them someplace like in a surface water, in a lake, if we find them in a groundwater well, to try to figure out how they got there, and it's not immediately apparent. And these are some of the processes that we look at to try to figure out where did it come from and where is it going. So one of the reasons we're having this talk is because PFAS has been found in active water. And so one of the things that our industry is trying to figure out is how can we protect drinking water from PFAS. So, you know, the most obvious thing when there's a compound like this is you find the source of it and you get rid of it. And then you find where the groundwater plume is that is impacting your drinking water well, and you either destroy the material and the compounds in situ in the ground, which you can do by adding chemicals to the ground that will oxidize it or reduce it, or by encouraging bacteria. But we haven't figured out how to do that yet for PFAS, although there's a very active research and development community trying to figure this out at the moment. So mostly if the PFAS compounds are interfering with a drinking water well or impacting the drinking water well, you have really one of two choices. One is you treat the water coming out of the well so that nobody drinks, so, you know, you remove it from the drinking water as it comes out of the well, or you try to intercept it on its way to the well. And that's actually something that's being done in South Acton, not for PFAS, but for dioxane. That's been coming from the nuclear metals site over towards the town walls in South Acton, and the contractor in charge of that site has put in an interceptor well that grabs some of the water before it gets to our wells, and so can treat it more effectively and much less expensively. And if we're going to treat it in drinking water, pretty much the most common thing, the most effective way to do it is to get it to sorb to something like activated carbon. Maybe you've seen carbon filters and pure filters and pitchers or under your sink, or that sort of thing. Another possibility is, and activated carbon works, but not terrifically well for PFAS, because it would just as much like to be in the water as stick to the carbon sometimes. There are these manufactured resins called ion exchange resins or anion exchange resins that work perhaps a little better than carbon, but are also more expensive. And that's become more common to use in drinking water systems. And then there are other technologies like membrane filtration, but that's rarely used because of cost. And I'll just mention that in a town right nearby, Air, Mass, they've just finished installing the first PFAS treatment plant in the state. I think it might still be classified as provisional or temporary, but it's a full-scale system. It's this is a headline from I think 1 week ago in the Lowell Sun, 2 weeks ago in the Lowell Sun. They're using anion exchange to remove the PFAS from the water as it comes out of the ground before it goes into their the distribution system. The way you figure that out is they tested a bunch of different things, and they found a resin that worked well. They scaled up their laboratory tests for about $3 million and installed a relatively big system. They a third the size of their existing treatment plant, and they're going to treat it's essentially a similar size to say what our North Acton treatment plant is in terms of the amount of flow that goes through there. So that's the type of thing that we might find in our town someday. So that's my 10-minute explanation of the thousands of hours of PFAS work that we've all been working on. And I'm done, Caroline. I'll stop sharing.
Carolyn, could you introduce Sandy, please?
Our next speaker is Sandy Baird, who is a toxicologist and environmental analyst with the Office of Research and Standards at the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, where she supports the air toxics and drinking water programs. Her responsibilities include developing cancer and non-cancer toxicity values, evaluating the implications of new toxicologic information and guidance, evaluation of site-specific toxicity and exposure assessment issues, and development of guidance in support of risk-based decision-making. Dr. Baird received her PhD in toxicology from the University of Rochester School of Medicine and Dentistry. Sandy.
Thank you, Carolyn. So tonight I'll be talking about giving you some background on the Massachusetts Drinking Water Guidelines and Standards, as well as the MCL derivation process. And I'll talk about some of the health effects from PFAS, as well as the derivation of the Mass DEP MCL for the 6 PFAS. Drinking water is regulated nationally by US EPA. They develop standards called maximum contaminant limits. These are enforceable, and they're adopted by the states, such as Massachusetts. Most of our MCLs that are in place in Massachusetts are from EPA. US EPA also derives guidance for, as Dan mentioned, these emerging contaminants, such as PFAS. Massachusetts also develops guidance, which we call the Office of Research and Standard Guidelines, which again is not enforceable, but it serves the same role of allowing us to evaluate chemicals that do not have MCLs and chemicals that are present in our water. Massachusetts also can develop MCLs, and we have developed 2 of those actually, perchlorate and the new MCL for PFAS, and these are enforceable standards. We derive a Massachusetts MCL in 2 steps. The first step is identifying this health-based goal, so sort of equivalent to the guidance, this Office of Research and Standards goal. The second step looks at other factors such as sort of laboratory detection capability as well as treatment processes, and that goes into deriving the final MMCL. I'm going to really focus on the toxicity piece, or the health basis of the ORSG, and it really all starts, I'm a toxicologist, so this is kind of, it starts with toxicity information, where we look at animal and human information and then would use that to derive toxicity values, both for non-cancer health effects as well as cancer health effects. And we would derive these separately. When we would then go for a drinking water concentration, we would use the toxicity values and derive independent ORSGs for the non-cancer health effects and the cancer health effects. The final ORSG would be based on the lower of these 2 values. And the ORSGs are concentrations that you could be exposed to for a lifetime without anticipated adverse effects. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what sort of goes into this so you can get a sort of a picture of it. So we take the toxicity information that's available that other groups like EPA have reviewed, or other states, as well as the studies that have been published in the primary literature. And I'm sure you've seen articles about PFAS and some different health effects. It feels like there's a new one every day. And we take these studies and we review them and try to, for sort of the quality of the studies, and also try to put together a story about how this chemical interacts in biological systems so that we can have an understanding of the dose-response relationship, as well as what effects are occurring at the lowest doses. Because when we identify the effects that are occurring at the lowest doses, that means that effects that occur at higher levels are protected against, because if you get at a higher dose, you're protected because we are using the lowest. We then put this on a sort of a human dose, and then account for any limitations in the data using uncertainty factors. The toxicity value comes out as sort of, it's like the amount of the chemical per kilogram body weight per day that you could have every day of your life, and health effects would not be expected. This is, of course, always based on the information that's available. And when we know more things, then we might change our minds about that. To get the drinking water concentration, we would take the toxicity value and then apply appropriate exposure assumptions, considering the sensitive populations for that particular chemical, as well as the potential for exposure from other sources. And the drinking water concentration then is the amount of the chemical per liter of water. So for PFAS, we're looking at nanograms per liter, or PPT. So typically, we would get toxicity values would be derived by US EPA from the health advisories or other of their systems for developing toxicity values. We would also look at values that have been developed by other states or international toxicology programs. And typically, we've used values that have been derived by other organizations after sort of seeing how they all fit together. And occasionally we would derive our own toxicity values. Switching it into PFAS and thinking about our MMCL. So the MMCL is for the sum of 6 PFAS, and the PFOA, PFAS, the PFHXS, PHHPA, PFNA, and PFDA. I'm not going to read out the chemical name, but it's there for your reference. And the piece that's sort of important for thinking about this, 6 chemicals were chosen, one, because they had shown up in drinking water samples in Massachusetts. They're also very similar in that they're 8 plus or minus 2 carbons. So they range from 6 to 10 carbons. So they're similar structurally. They have similar toxic effects, and they all have a long persistence in the body. And why are we concerned about these? Really, we're concerned because infants and children are at risk. This chemical is able to cross the placenta, as well as being expressed in breast milk, and that represents an exposure pathway. And as I mentioned, there's toxicity at low exposure levels, and they're persistent. So not only, as Dan mentioned, they're not broken down in the environment, but they also stay in the body for a long time, and they end up in water. So the health effects that we know of now that are sort of our main concerns are effects on the immune system, effects during development, effects in the endocrine system, effects in the liver, as well as elevated cancer risk. One of the challenges for regulating PFAS is that new information is coming, all the time, as I mentioned, and we have to pull everything together to sort of try to understand it, and use multiple studies so that we have confidence in the information. Of the 6 PFAS, the PFOA and PFAS are the most studied. They were sort of the earliest identified as concerns, and there's less data on the other PFAS in the subgroup, but there are similar responses and potencies seen, which is why we've grouped those together. So as far as regulating them, in June of 2018, the Office of Research and Standards adopted a guideline and Mass DEP adopted a guideline of 70 PPT for PFOA and PFAS, as well as 3 additional PFAS. This was based on the 2016 EPA health advisory value for PFOA and PFAS. So their health advisory value was 70. So we adopted that concentration, but extended it to these other compounds that were present in our water and very similar in structure. Pretty much as soon as that was adopted, new information became available that hadn't been available in 2016. And that prompted us to continue to look in more detail at the toxicity of that information. What we found was that we're seeing multiple effects in these studies that were occurring at lower exposure levels than had been present in the studies that were the basis of the EPA health advisory of 70 ppp. And so taken together, they raised some concerns that the 70 ppt wasn't protective enough, but the individual studies weren't, they all had some limitations, so we didn't feel comfortable using them as a basis of a new toxicity value. And we just concluded that we should apply an additional uncertainty factor to account for this, these health effects of about 3, and then that would be an appropriate solution to this, addressing our concerns. So in January, an ORSG of 20 ppt was adopted. This represents with the toxicity value decreased by the factor of 3. There's rounding involved. And the addition of the 6th perfluorinated chemical, PFDA, all the other elements of the 2018 ORSG were the same. And if the technical report that supports these decisions and the thoughts that went into this is available online. I don't know if this link will work, but you can Google it. Just earlier actually last month, after going through a regulatory process, Mass DEP adopted the MMCL that was based on the ORSG in January of 2020. So the new MMCL is 20 ppt for the 6 PFAS. This is, and it's applicable to each of the PFAS individually as well as the sum of them together. And note again that this is an enforceable standard versus a guidance value. It changes the responsibilities. Sort of in response to the rapidly changing, information, as part of the regulation includes a 3-year reevaluation process for the MMCL. I wanted to just give you a point of comparison to the other PFAS values. So if you look on the left here, we're seeing EPA, and across the top is the individual PFAS that we regulate. And in the blue circle is the Massachusetts MMCL. And you can see that Vermont and Connecticut also use the sum of 5 PFAS. And many other states, there's sort of the 10 states that are have their own drinking water values that are lower than the EPA Health Advisory. They might use individual values. Some of them are lower than ours or higher, but because we have the sum of all of those 6, that actually makes it more health protective. So we've covered those other chemicals. And just to sort of wrap it up, we have an MCL of 20 ppt. We consider it health-based and protective of the most sensitive populations, and it accounts for exposure to other sources in addition to drinking water. And we will be reviewing this every 3 years. Thank you. And I want to acknowledge my colleagues, Dr. Sadash Zudi, for her work in this, major work in this, and Dr. Mark Smith, the Director of the Office of Research and Standards. Thanks.
Thanks, Sandy. So I am awestruck at how much work has been done by scientists, engineers, and regulators to bring us to the point we're at right now. So Dan will now bring us down to the local level. Carolyn, could you tell us a bit about Dan's background?
Okay.
Matt will bring us there.
We'll go to Matthew. I'd like to introduce Matt Mostaller, who's the environmental manager for the Water Supply District of Acton, an independent government entity with the responsibility of supplying water to the town of Acton. He oversees all aspects of water resources, management, regulatory compliance, and public outreach. He is a licensed water system operator and is active in state and regional water works organizations. His experiences include treatment plant operations, new source development, watershed management, groundwater remediation, and administering conservation and efficiency programs. Matt has a BS in environmental science from St. Michael's College and a Master's of Public Administration with a focus on state and local government from Suffolk University. On November 6th, he will be recognized by the Massachusetts Waterworks Association with the Executive Director's Award for his ongoing work related to PFAS. So Matt, you're on.
Thanks, Carolyn. So the reason that I'm here tonight is because I'm speaking from experience. I've been the technical lead on PFAS here in Acton. I've participated in the rulemaking process for both waste site cleanup and drinking water here in Massachusetts. And I've personally collected over 100 PFAS samples now. I've coordinated our public outreach efforts. And as a reminder, I'm just here representing our elected Board of Commissioners and the staff of AWD. We are a team of about 20 people that make decisions and manage this system for everyone. So I just want to go through some early actions relative to PFAS here in Acton. So back in 2013 and 2014, as part of the Safe Drinking Water Act, we were required to monitor for PFAS under what's called the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule. We didn't anticipate finding PFAS in our system at that point in time. We looked for 6 compounds, and that was at the part per billion detection limit. Now, as Sandra mentioned, we are looking at the part per trillion level. So it was a very different kind of analytical environment that we're in. The standard methods associated with PFAS have been changing during that time. There's been increased media attention, and this is how some of the earliest systems were identified to have PFAS, was through this UCMR program. Since 2014, we've been following changes to both science and policy relative to PFAS. We understand that there's new health studies coming out regularly, and you know, we started to wonder, hey, is this going to be a problem for Acton? So one thing that we did early on was evaluate our watersheds and look for PFAS sources. At the time, we didn't identify any major contributors that gave us concern. But during that time, we also began to watch some of our neighboring communities, Littleton, Air, Hudson, Stowe, started to show up as local places impacted. And during that time, we've also seen our understanding of what PFAS can come from has been changing. Dan gave some great examples. There's a couple on there that he didn't get, and that has been an ongoing thing that we've been interested in. So in 2019, we were notified that the Superfund sites, for those of you who aren't aware, there are 2 Superfund sites that impact the town of Acton, that they were going to conduct groundwater sampling to understand whether or not there were PFAS concerns at those sites. Similar to 1,4-dioxane, the federal government has one set of standards, and the state of Massachusetts has a different set of standards. The W.R. Grace site was going to focus their PFAS on previously identified source areas, so places where they had taken you know, actions or there had been known contamination, and decide from there what additional actions were needed. The nuclear metals site did a more comprehensive sampling event because they're in a different place in their cleanup, and that included looking at our Assabet production wells, and they are going to look potentially at some additional sampling in higher concentration areas. These are just 2 maps to give you an idea. This map here is the nuclear metals plan of sampling. The next one here is the W.R. Grace site, and the green boxes that you see on the screen are the fairly limited sample locations that they looked for PFAS. So with the Superfund sites looking for PFAS right in our backyard, we began discussions last fall, the fall of 2019, about how we were going to handle that. So we came up with a plan once we received some of the initial data from the Superfund program that said, hey, we should look ourselves. Mind you, this is before the state of Massachusetts is requiring public water systems to look for PFAS. We decided to go ahead and begin to look based on that data set the Superfund program came up with. So in January of 2020, we initiated sampling in South Acton. We knew there were going to be some issues with that. One was lab capacity, so there's only a handful of labs that can meet the strict requirements that the state and federal government have for looking at PFAS. There were issues with coordinating sample collection with the maintenance of our water system. So as you can imagine, the winter tends to be a lower water demand period, so we tried to do a lot of our maintenance work there, and it made it difficult to have all of our treatment plants and wells operating at that time. Sometime during the winter, Mass DEP got more involved in our process, and that was a welcomed bit of assistance that they provided. They worked with us to further develop our sampling plan. Initially, they were going to actually do some of the sample collection, but then they deferred that to the district based on our capabilities to handle that, and they provided assistance with analytical costs. Unfortunately, COVID-19 hit, and that gave us a little bit more of a roadblock than we anticipated. And it stalled our work, and it slowed down the regulatory process at Mass DEP. So to date, we have some results that we would like to share with folks. In our treated water, we've seen concentrations as low as below the method detection limit, all the way up to 47.24 parts per trillion. I did see a question come in earlier about how many compounds we're testing for, and we're looking at 18, although there's only 6 regulated. Our raw water has seen concentrations between just under 5 and up to 93. And currently, and this is a really important takeaway, about 71% of our water is currently below the recently adopted MCL of 20 parts per trillion. And this is just a chart demonstrating where our concentrations are. The 2 yellow lines that you see in the middle here, those represent our North Acton treatment plant, which has been offline since April. So it's important to note that those high numbers are not representative of what's in the system currently. We do use granulated activated carbon in West Acton, and that represents the non-detects that we're talking about here. And from a health perspective, you know, these risk values and the toxicology work, those values are on somewhat of a spectrum. So 18 parts per trillion and 22 parts per trillion probably don't have much difference in terms of their risk, but you know, regulations need to fine tune in on a number. So as you're assessing your own personal risk tolerance, keep in mind that you know, it is somewhat on a spectrum. I do want to talk a little bit about where we're seeing the PFAS. So we did identify it in all 22 operating wells that we have. So we have wells in West Acton, South Acton, Acton Center, and North Acton right up here. And we have seen concentrations in all of those locations. There's also hundreds of private wells here in Acton. And certainly if you're in proximity to our production wells, there may be reason for you to go and sample. And if you do have a private well and you've generated data and you want to share that with us, it can certainly help us better understand the extent of the PFAS impacts here in town. And in addition, there's also 6 other public water systems that operate here in Acton. And as far as I know, none of those 6 have tested for PFAS at this time. So response actions that we have taken that were more immediate, we shut down our Assabet 1A well, which at the time had the highest concentration of PFAS. We followed that by shutting off the entire North Acton treatment plant. As I showed in the previous slide, we did see much more elevated concentrations of PFAS there. And we've been doing additional monitoring. In a minimum, we're doing quarterly monitoring, but like I mentioned, we've done well over 100 samples now, and that's to really better understand how PFAS is impacting our sources, how it's interacting with our current treatment practices, and you know, we will continue to do that in the immediate future. We did remove some PFAS-containing plumbing materials at our sample taps. We've also retained an engineer to help us develop some treatment-based solutions. And we're also working with the town of Acton. We've notified the town manager. We've worked with the Board of Health to make sure they're aware of these concerns in town. And that's been ongoing work since December of 2019. Finally, we did develop our customer notice that hopefully all of you received in the mail. And you know, that had a lot of information in it, as well as our website, actonwater.com/PFAS. And really, all of that work was directed at the subpopulation. That's where the most concern is: pregnant women, nursing mothers, and infants, based on the current understanding of the health, potential health impacts on humans. But in order to get that out, because that's a very tough subpopulation to communicate to, we had to do a very broad notice. So we did do a postal patron mailing and also targeted multi-unit apartments and condominiums. So ongoing actions, things that we're hoping are going to help in both the long and short term time periods. In South Acton, we've been changing the combination of wells that we're operating. That has been helping us achieve treated water below the 20 part per trillion. Currently, we're trying to reactivate the Assabet 2 well, which shows lower concentrations of PFAS. And we're also looking at the potential connection of the Assabet 3 well. Some of you may know that is WRG3, which is an old Grace production well, which also has been exhibiting lower PFAS concentrations. We're also looking at ways to better manage our treatment plant waste at that facility that may also have an impact. In Acton Center, where our Conant 1 and Conant 2 wells are located, we're currently constructing a treatment plant for minerals removal there. And that's going to combine our 2 Conant well sites along Main Street. You may have seen that construction work going on. And we're currently evaluating how that new treatment plant may be able to assist in reducing the PFAS concentrations. We're also looking at a potential bedrock source of supply in that area. And we are currently working towards the permitting phase for that source. You can see a drill rig here on the screen. So the wells are in place, but we need to expedite some work there. Finally, in North Acton, this week we're completing a pilot test where we've been looking at 6 types of media. Dan very graciously talked about some of these, so I won't get into too much detail, but we were recently awarded $200,000 in a grant from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to help pay for that work. It was one of 10 grants awarded. And we've also applied for a 0% construction loan to help pay for construction of that chosen technology when that time comes. We've also recently joined a multi-district litigation being represented by Napoli Stolnik PLC. And the idea here is we have not identified a responsible party. So Dan kind of alluded to some very distinct PFAS sources. We haven't come to that here in Acton yet. So by joining this litigation, we may be able to recover costs to help pay for some of our efforts to address PFAS here in Acton. We're also looking at potential new PFAS treatment technologies, although that would take a long time to get to being able to use those, but we are looking at those options. So I want to thank you all for participating tonight. If you have not already signed up for our PFAS updates, please send an email to wq@actonwater.com. Also visit our website. There's some great resources there where you can find out more about what we're doing here locally. And as we have new data, it will also be posted to that website. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Dan, you should take a look in the chat. There's a whole bunch of congratulations that have rolled in on your award from the Massachusetts Waterworks Association.
You know, my middle name is Matthew, so
No,
I can see why you'd say that.
I'm really sorry to both of you.
It's
I
okay.
really do know the difference between you. Matt, you should look at the congratulations that have been rolling in. And I would actually like to invite you to switch to gallery view now and ask some of you if you might want to turn your video on and offer a visual applause to our speakers out there for their excellent work. I'm sorry you can't hear this because it doesn't come across on Zoom, but I hope that you speakers are feeling appreciated because we do really feel honored that you're able to come and share your insights and your knowledge with us. So we're going to switch now to Q&A. And I guess I'd like to start by inviting the speakers if they have questions for each other. And I actually have a question as well. So I will start with my question, which is, we have this 1,4-dioxane problem here as well as the PFAS problem. Do we know anything about what happens to people who are exposed to both? How do these two potential contaminants interact with each other? I know that's a harder question than dealing with just one contaminant at a time. So that sounds like a Sandy question.
Yeah, it sounds like a Sandy question.
Yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah, I have not looked at that,
Okay.
and I don't, that would be a kind of a place by place kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
We could look at it, but a lot of it goes back. I mean, it goes back to what's affected, how it operates, and we don't have a lot of information about mode of action, so it might be, challenging, but we can, it's something we could look at.
So certainly that would be of interest in our community and perhaps in others as well. So go ahead, Sandy.
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah.
So if you're below the levels where effects, so like the MCL or the ORSG for the 1,4-dioxane,
Mm-hmm.
you have a much less likelihood of having interactions because the concentrations are where you're not expecting an effect, just as a sort of a point of reassurance, but definitely something we can look at.
Okay, thank you. Do you have questions you want to ask each other before I start reading questions from the public?
I have a question for Matt, or maybe I think I know the answer. The lawsuit that you mentioned is, since we can't point a finger at someone or some place where PFAS got released, the lawsuit is against the people that manufactured PFAS, right? Who may never have heard of Acton, Massachusetts, but they made PFAS.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, Dan. Since we haven't found a local responsible party, we are looking to, with hundreds of other, water suppliers and communities, looking to hold the manufacturers of these chemicals responsible. Public water suppliers right now are being asked to take on, a very big role in addressing a society-wide problem. You mentioned some great things that PFAS have done to advance modern day life. But now that we're finding out more about it, we're being given a very direct first responder role in addressing some of these issues.
Okay, any more questions amongst yourselves before I go to the audience questions? Okay, so I'm going to read audience questions. And I should also say that if perchance we don't get through all the audience questions, we're cutting off at 8:30. If we don't get through all the audience questions before then, the panelists have generously agreed to help us develop answers to any questions that are left. We'll save the chat and we'll put them on the Green Acton site. But to start with, a question that came by email. How are the companies responding to their own role in increasing levels of PFAS and lowering them? So I understand this question to mean both the companies that manufactured PFAS and companies that used or use PFAS in their products.
Let me take a swing at that.
Great.
Yeah, so interestingly, in the United States and Western Europe made a, they have phased out the production of PFAS in the United States and Western Europe. So I don't think the amount that's produced is either zero or negligible compared to what it was before, say, 2005 or something like that. China and Russia and other parts of Asia have not phased out PFAS. So products in the United States may or may not have, that used to have PFAS may or may not have PFAS now, depending on where that product or some of the stuff in the product is sourced. So that's an interesting little piece. So PFAS is so that the category of stuff called PFAS. I noticed that one of the questions in the chat was about other compounds. There's these new generation compounds, Gen X, and there's a variety of PFAS-like compounds out there that are in use. It's a complicated world, and with many chemicals. So all of these things that we like, the slippery nature of PFAS, the fact that they don't burn, they have all sorts of great properties. And so PFAS are no longer manufactured in the United States. Things that look a little bit like PFAS are. That's the best I can tell you.
Can I just clarify for a sec?
Yeah.
So I hear you say PFAS, which in my mind means like the whole universe of PFAS, but maybe so PFAS and PFOA are like two individual members of the PFAS family, and those were phased out after from 2005 or 2015. And so those are supposedly no longer manufactured in the US, but what has happened is other PFAS, so called the short chain PFAS and other, because we still would like to have those properties, so there's newer chemicals that are being used in products and being manufactured in the US and being imported as part of products. So this story is complicated.
So another question closely related refers to these other shorter chain chemicals and points out that the trade organizations like the American Chemistry Council object to the idea that these new compounds should be regulated as a group like PFAS. How do you believe that we will deal with, or how should we deal with this new group of PFAS analogs, the shorter chains? Is that something Mass DEP is looking at, or?
We have started looking at the available toxicity information for the shorter PFAS. I think it seems like that, could be an important story. We haven't gotten far enough along to sort of know how that will play out. There's many discussions now about sort of grouping versus not grouping, and this is just me not speaking for DEP, but we would, there's different ways that you could group chemicals, and so we need to think about how that relates to chemicals that might be found together, how that relates to their biological properties, and how that relates to maybe how they're distributed in the environment. So there's definitely a lot of thinking going on in the background about how to manage this really large group of chemicals.
The concept of trying to get your mind around thousands of different chemicals in one regulatory regime is just mind-boggling.
So Sandra, Sandy, here's a question. So one of the other compounds that EPA is just about to or is regulating is PFBS, which is like half the size of PFOS, and it's notably less toxic. Is that sort of a characteristic? The shorter chain compounds tend to be less toxic than the longer chain compounds?
That's sort of the general. So but you really have to look at the individual chemicals. So the PFBS is excreted more rapidly, and so it doesn't accumulate as much in the body. So if you think about toxicity as sort of the amount you ingest from the outside versus like the internal concentration, definitely looks a lot less toxic. If we think about internal concentrations, because we have to, I can't say that it's less toxic without thinking about like exactly how it relates to the concentrations that might be in someone's body. And that's, and of course, one of the things that we are going to be exploring, in more detail as we, shift our focus from these first 6 chemicals.
Our next question is very practical from David. Thanks for all this information. Would you recommend families with younger children get some sort of home filtration system?
Is that me again?
Any of you, yes.
Well, it depends on whether you think your water is higher than the MCL. So the MCL has been developed to be protective of infants that have the highest exposure. So breastfeeding infants have the highest exposure, and relates. So if you're below the MCL, it seems like it is probably not necessary to do that. It depends in part on how You think about risks, but if it's higher than the MCL, that's definitely something to think carefully about. And I think there's no one, because higher could mean different things. So it's definitely something to maybe have a conversation with toxicologist or somebody about.
So I can say that I live in one of the relatively small handful of households in Acton that have private wells. And I just researched how to get your private well tested and wrote about that on the Green Acton website. So if you're a person who doesn't know how much PFAS you might have in your water, there's ways to find out if you can't count on Matt and his colleagues figuring that out on your behalf. Let's see. From Deborah, is there any information on endocrine disrupting effects of exposures to PFAS-6, even at sub-MCL levels?
The thyroid hormone effect is sort of the most well known, and it's something that is an ongoing area of research. And I don't think that that's really been resolved. And it's not something that came up in particular for these chemicals, but depends on so what studies are done and what information comes forward for the future.
Okay, so the next question is, do we test for all 6 PFAS chemicals? And how often do we test? And I think we heard from Matt that they test for, what did you say, 18, including the 6 regulated ones. And do the levels differ in different parts of Acton? We saw the answer to that in one of the earlier slides, so thank you. Here's another practical question. Has anyone measured the concentration of PFAS in bottled water we can buy in the supermarkets? Question from Richard.
Yes.
Okay, and where would you point someone to look for that information?
I heard something in the news recently about it. There was PFAS in somebody's bottled water.
Yeah, so Mass DEP on their website, which you can get to from our website, does have a list of bottled water providers that have tested and have voluntarily given their results to Mass DEP. So really that is, one way to get it. The other way to do it would be to reach out to a particular bottler and ask them, what is your PFAS testing protocol and results.
Consumer Reports just did a study on a bunch of bottled water. There's a link to that on the Green Acton website as well. You can get inside Consumer Reports with your Acton Memorial library card. Let's see. Now we have a question from another water professional. I'm going to read it verbatim because I don't understand it. Water systems are required to sample for the UCMR3 list of PFAS. How do the PFAS monitored under UCMR3 differ from the PFAS in the various new standards?
I'll take a crack at that. I don't have the UCMR3 list in front of me, but at the time there were 6 compounds that they were looking for, 6 very specific compounds. And I do not believe that mimicked Massachusetts 6.
It's not identical, but it's
close.
There's a lot of overlap.
Yeah.
This is Mark Smith just jumping in. Yeah, so the UCMR3 list included 5 of the longer chain compounds that we're regulating and 1 of the shorter chain compounds that we haven't focused on because it does appear to be less toxic and less persistent. So there's considerable overlap, but it's not identical.
Thank you. That was Mark Smith. He works in the same part of Mass DEP as Sandy.
He's the director of the Office of Research.
The director of the office.
Yeah.
Okay, here's another question. A question from Beatrice. How are W.R. Grace and NMI being held accountable for their role in adding PFAS to the environment?
So I will briefly touch on that. Based on the limited monitoring that they have done right now, they do not believe that they have contributed PFAS to the environment per se. So each site had one of their sample locations that was deemed higher than expected. So, you know, there really isn't a direct connection saying that either one of the Superfund sites are responsible for PFAS contamination. And, you know, that bears out with what Dan was saying earlier about kind of the ubiquitous nature of PFAS in a number of different industries and in a number of different products. And if I harken back a couple of years ago, I think Kim had inquired with the Superfund program about the potential for PFAS, and neither site had a record of using PFAS in their production. But, you know, in my opinion, they still have more work to, you know, kind of tune into their response of no responsibility.
Okay, from that, how is the activated carbon that treats PFAS disposed of? So the material left behind on the filtration media, what do you do with that, and is that someplace safe?
So it's incinerated. So activated carbon, you heat it up very high temperatures. There's a lot of question about how well that works for PFAS and which PFAS compounds volatilize and which don't and which burn off. So, but you send it back to the Calgon, and they put it in a very high temperature incinerator. And that, I didn't say anything about this before, but that's also sort of like the only method that we know of at the moment for treating, say, soil that has PFAS in it. So if there's soil that has PFAS in it and it's sitting there and it rains and it leaches a little bit of PFAS into the groundwater, there's not much you can do with that except for possibly burn it. And there's only one or maybe two permitted incinerators for that in the country. One of them's in Alaska. Yeah, you have to burn it.
And does that break the carbon fluorine links? And
no, I mean, that's how you make activated carbon. Does it make? What do they do with it? Some of it, if you heat it high enough, it will break down the PFAS compounds. Okay.
I just wanted to make sure it's not just going into the atmosphere and
incinerator. I think that it's still actually a little bit of an area of active research. What exactly is going
on? So this is a question from Beatrix. I have, it says right here, is water deployment based on proximity to a well or another method? And I had a little conversation with her, so I know that question has to do with if you're living near a certain Acton Water District well, do you get water from that well?
Yeah. And I blew right through that. I had a note right here on my slide, and I got caught up in the moment. So proximity to a treatment plant does not necessarily dictate that you'll be getting water from that treatment plant. For example, I mentioned our North Acton treatment plant has been offline since April. So folks in that part of town clearly are not getting water from that plant. So right now, folks in North Acton are getting water from Acton Center. Folks in Acton Center are getting water from South Acton, and folks in West Acton are getting a blend of waters from West and South Acton. So one of the things that we've been answering a lot of questions about really gets down to the hydraulics of our water system and how there's blending occurring, how a neighborhood isn't necessarily served by the same source of water every day of the year. And, you know, one of the things that we believe to be going on is water goes out into our distribution system and mixes with lower concentration PFAS water. We're probably seeing lower concentrations of PFAS reaching the consumer tap.
From Ruth, is there any data on residents who have reported feeling unwell or having health issues due to water?
So anecdotally, I can think of this year 3 people that have specifically called and conveyed that they believe the water was making them ill. Typically, waterborne illness is going to be something that impacts a large number of folks. It's less likely to be on an individualized basis. And typically, we wouldn't be fielding that. There'd be a larger either public health outbreak, and we'd be getting a notification from a local hospital, the Department of Public Health. So at this point in time, I don't believe there's any data set to try and link illness to drinking water.
Can I ask a question, Sandy? Maybe I missed it in your talk, but does the DEP have a, do you guys have a percentage of the amount of PFAS that people take into their bodies? How much of that comes from water versus other avenues, other sources?
So we have built into the MCL a sort of that 20% of your dose, so the allowable dose, if we go back to the toxicity value, that would be sort of your allowable daily dose. When we derive the drinking water value, we say only 20% of your dose can come from the drinking water, because we realize that PFAS is present in other things. There are other states that use other, sort of assume other amounts, greater amounts could come from drinking water. But this is sort of the typical sort of default conservative estimate for basically the water just represents a fraction of your total allowable exposure. Because you may not get that from other sources, or you may get that from other sources, but it's sort of a health protective decision to assume that only 20% of your allowable daily dose comes from the water.
Right. So another way of saying that is we're all exposed to PFAS via a variety of mechanisms, and at the limit that Massachusetts has set, only the expectation is that that's only 20% of what people will take in on a daily basis or annual basis.
So we sort of say 80% of your, dose might come from other sources. It's basically, it's so the inverse is if we only allow 20% to come from the drinking water when we have to set a specific number, we're saying up to 80% could come from other sources. And that why, so it's just
that's food and dust and anyway.
Right. Exactly.
It's also important to keep in mind, it's not just the proportion of, what you're being exposed to from drinking water versus other things. There's also an assumption that, you're drinking contaminated water every single day, over a lifetime to anticipate some of these health effects. So, drinking the water for, several months, a year and a half, whatever, you may not actually develop any of these health concerns because, again, Mass DEP is predicating things on a lifetime of exposure for most, adults and older children, is my understanding.
Right. So so we look at the allowable dose. We know that these accumulate in people's bodies. So we use an internal measure of what sort of what a safe concentration would be in, we're using the current practices to use serum concentration. And then because PFAS is expressed in breast milk, and infants are the smallest, are very small, and the amount that they would, being breast milk being their sole source during sort of early, depending on how long, for the first 6 months. So we consider this to be very health protective. So it's basically the nursing mom who drinks the most water, 3.2 liters per day, which is versus the sort of a typical assumption for an adult is 2 liters per day. So we are sort of this allows us to protect sort of the entire population. Many people could drink more than that before they would need to have a higher exposure and for drink more before the health effects might impact them. Like say, like myself as an older mature woman, I could drink more before the health effects, I would be concerned about health effects than a nursing mother could drink before.
We have another practical question. I don't think we'll be able to answer it as asked, but we can answer it perhaps in a more general way. What is the recommended whole house filtration system and any recommended companies to install? So I don't think anybody here is going to recommend a specific company, but could you speak in more generalities about what kinds of things you might want to take into account while contemplating a household filtration system?
So I'll just refer to some information that's on our website that addresses this. Again, if you haven't been to it, I highly encourage you to visit it. But what we have been discussing with customers is if you choose to go the filtration route, there's two technologies that are pretty popular out there. Reverse osmosis is one. There seems to be a real push in town that everyone needs to have an RO system, which probably is not the case. And carbon is the other technology. And a couple things to keep in mind, carbon is going to be cheaper to install, it's going to be cheaper to maintain, and it is going probably be able to, deal with whatever concentrations we're talking about. RO systems are going to be more costly up front. They're going to be more costly to maintain. They're going to use more water. So to produce clean water through an RO system typically uses up to 3 times the volume of water that you end up with. And there's also a problem in terms of generating a waste product with an RO system. You need to discharge that reject water somewhere. And Mass DEP, the septic system regulations actually prohibit that discharge. And that is a challenge. We already kind of talked about what do we do with carbon that's sorbed PFAS to it. Certainly that is an ongoing issue. And then just a general note, regulation of PFAS is flashed forward ahead of the filtration companies because currently there isn't a certification in place that reaches the 20 part per trillion that we're talking about here in Massachusetts. So currently filter companies get certified on the federal standard of 70 parts per trillion for 2 compounds. So, although there are effective filters out there, you're not necessarily going to find one that is certified to do what you might be wanting it to do here in Acton.
And can I just one thing to add to that? I worked for a water supply section of the state of Connecticut for a little while, and one of the things that I learned is that activated carbon systems that people put in their basement, they put under their sink, if they're not maintained properly, can actually be a health hazard because if you don't change out the carbon frequently and keep the whole system cleaned properly, you're going to end up with bacteria growing in there, and that's actually a health hazard. So, it's not, I always caution people that they really need to be careful if they're going to use a carbon-based system, which of course is what, almost, some large percentage of home water filtration systems are carbon, and that's because it's cheap and sort of foolproof in a lot of ways, but you do need to maintain it properly.
Dan, can I offer you a job answering phones here for a few days? that was great.
No, you cannot. Thank you, though.
That's one thing that we share with people often about any kind of filter, just like you said. So great advice. And one other thing on filters, I've talked to numerous customers that have asked about the refrigerator filters. And the best thing you can do there is reach out to the manufacturer of that filter. A lot of people have done that, and they have found out that the filter they're already using is effective at reducing some PFAS compounds. So that's a very simple thing folks can do.
But again, those filters are very small and have very carbon filters have a different amount of capacity for different kind of compounds. Their capacity for PFAS is much smaller than the compounds that those are usually created for. So if you're going to rely on a water filter in a pitcher or a water filter in a refrigerator, you need to change it out much more frequently than you do for the classic recommended periods.
So I have here a question about the lawsuit. So can the lawsuit be impactful without federal level classification as hazardous? Are the Massachusetts regulations enough to require the responsible parties, once identified, to pay for cleanup? I know we don't have a legal expert here, but if you have any thoughts on that, we'd love to hear.
So without getting into too much detail, this particular lawsuit is not focused on hazardous materials. So it's not your kind of classic environmental legal case. This is essentially a defective product case. So it's basically asserting that the companies knew that there were negative impacts associated with the compounds they were producing, and that caused harm to the general public.
Thank you. So Allison Fieldjuma from ORS, an organization that concerns itself with surface water, is asking, when will Massachusetts develop surface water standards for PFAS? That's not exactly your part of Mass DEP, but if you had an idea, Sandy, we'd love to hear that too.
I do not know what the plans are for that.
Okay, we can try to find that out. Go ahead.
But there's one thing. So surface water, oftentimes those standards are based on ecological risk, not human health risk. And so far, the considerations, at least at the EPA level, are that ecological risk is, the concentrations are have to be much higher to represent a risk than the concentrations that we're using for human health.
Yeah, this is Mark Smith again. That is correct. And I would just note that the MCP standards for hazardous waste sites did consider eco risk impacts for these compounds, so that they were considered there. It's not exactly the same or not exactly analogous to a surface water kind of standard, but those risks were considered. The one area that is of concern that wasn't is the potential for some of the sulfonated compounds to bioaccumulate into fish, so that there can be a potential human exposure pathway, and we're considering that and looking at that for the future.
Thank you, Mark. A lot of different things to be taken into account here. Here's another issue. Ed asks, since you removed piping containing PFAS in the town plumbing system, you referred to that, Matt, when you were talking about the steps you had taken, should we be concerned about plastic piping in our homes containing PFAS material?
So two specific things that we were addressing. One was the use of Teflon tape. The other was the use of pipe compound, which tends to get used pretty liberally in water system work. And really, we focused on the direct sample tap. So we didn't want our samples to have a spike of PFAS. We had seen that in some other work that we did. So that was a very discrete area of our plumbing that we focused on. It's not necessarily the pipes, it's just the joints that we were focused on. So I don't think anyone needs to be running out and tearing out their plumbing relative to it. It's not like a lead pipe where there's going to be this constant leaching. This was very targeted at the sample tap that we were collecting our samples in.
Let's see. Is it true that PFAS is found in airborne ambient air as well as in rainwater? Question from Alan.
Yes, it has been measured in rainwater, and it can be attached to the particles that would make up the PM 2.5. The perfluorinated chemicals in air is sort of a an area of of expanding research. I can't say much more than that.
Okay. And then let's see. Does PFAS come from our household wastewater as well as more industrial commercial sources? If so, how can we reduce it?
So PFAS is present in our household wastewater, both from potentially products that we've washed as well as that which we might excrete from our bodies. And that is, so from the perspective of if you use fewer products that contain PFAS materials and you have but ingest and process less PFAS materials, then your own wastewater that would then be lower.
If you're concerned about PFAS in toiletries and your shampoo and so forth, the Environmental Working Group has extensive discussion of what kind of toiletries have lower PFAS values in them. So if you're concerned about contributing PFAS to your own wastewater via your household products, that would be a place to look to start cutting down your own PFAS contribution to the wastewater stream.
And those types of things are likely to be a greater contributor than your own excretion of PFAS, higher concentrations.
Yeah, and this is Mark Smith again, just based on personal experience. I would imagine some of us may have some old fabric treatments sitting in the basement that were PFAS containing products. So obviously dumping those down the sink would be a pretty significant potential contributor to loadings to wastewater. So try to put those aside for your local hazardous waste collection day or programs.
And like Matt was saying, if you're like me and you bought Teflon, a couple of things of Teflon tape 25 years ago, you still have them around your house. Those could have PFAS in them, whereas maybe modern Teflon tape would have less. So
somebody asked, do you know when the changeover was? Do you know how old it would have to be too old?
They started phasing PFOA and PFAS out of products a while back. The target was, I don't know, they started in 2005, the target was 2010, 2014, or whatever it was.
So if it's old enough that you don't remember buying it,
Yeah, if you remember, I don't know. There's ski wax, there was a time when fluorocarbon-based ski waxes were really popular for cross-country skiing. Does anybody have any of those in their basement?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, there was actually a research project done. I believe it was Colby College students did a research project on that exact issue recently, and published a paper on the findings of that cross-country ski wax.
It
wasn't good.
Yeah, it's all over the place.
I mean, some of the studies that we have for looking at PFAS effects are based on, this is very high exposure, but the sort of the professional ski waxers for the competitive teams, they would, they bring their little trailer along and they, wax the skis for everybody on their team, and they had, pretty significant exposures.
Yep. So we're almost at the end of our list of questions, which is good because we're almost out of time. But one more question from Karen. Can you please discuss the information in the alert letter that stated that sensitive subgroups with cuts or broken skin should also avoid long baths in PFAS contaminated water? Is that a dangerous source?
It is a potential route of exposure, so that would be sort of very conservative to avoid that. I don't think that is a really great route, route of exposure. That's a lot that there should be a lot of concern about. And I guess unless you're spending hours and hours and hours, but even then, the properties of these chemicals make them so they don't really transfer across the skin. And I don't know exactly how they would operate in the tissues, but I don't think should be a big concern.
Yeah, the one bright spot for these compounds is that they do not absorb well across intact skin. So, showering and bathing is not really a significant source of exposure. The one caveat for the broken skin issue might be for individuals with extensive skin conditions, psoriasis or severe eczema. And in those situations, you might get a little bit more of an exposure because of the interruption of the skin barrier. So it's a quite precautionary recommendation to avoid exposing cut skin. But in those situations, one might want to consider that exposure pathway.
Yeah, my understanding there is there are some changes to some of that language that was utilized in our public notification. So new public notices in the future, I believe Mass DEP has alternate language that, kind of doesn't give that same guidance. I'm also aware in the state of Connecticut, I believe it is, they have a value that they've actually put on, potential exposure from bathing. And it's in the hundreds of parts per trillion range. I believe 210 is the number that I read. So it's much, much higher than these relatively low concentrations that we're talking about here in Acton.
Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up now. We got to almost every question, and the couple of questions that I skipped or that we didn't get to, we'll try to get the answers up on the website. I wanted to thank you all for coming. We had 100 people here, which is amazing, given how many other distractions there are at this time and place, and for your great questions. And thanks again to our panelists. Let's see. Both the Green Acton and the League of Women Voters welcome new members. Here, I'm going to share my screen briefly and show you how to find us. You should be seeing Green Acton and the League of Women Voters right now. Maybe not.
Nope.
Nope.
Your email.
My email, sorry. That didn't work. Lovely.
It was a good email.
Let's try again. Okay, now, yes, the green
There we
box
go.
around what I wanted to show you. So Green Acton and the League of Women Voters both welcome members who are interested in civic engagement or in environmental issues respectively. These are our URLs. The Green Acton site also has several web posts about PFAS, including some news you can use. And of course, the information on the Acton Water District site is great as well. So thank you all for coming, and good night.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome.